Hello and welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, we're talking all things behavioural finance. To do so, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Crosby. Daniel, thanks for joining me.
Colin, my pleasure.
I'm excited for this one, and I've got a bit of a statistical bit of analysis that I'm going to share with you, Daniel. And I think you're the best person to help me answer it. Of the 130 so episodes that I've released in the podcast, in the top 5 most listened to them, 4 of them are all related to finance. So that's whether that's investing, crypto, how to own the world with Andrew Craig, even Forex. Those are way up there at the top. But as a percentage of the episodes that I've released, finance is not among the top ones. There's been a lot of finance episodes, but not enough that it would be statistically likely that they would all be up the top. With the work that you've done in behavioral finance, can you maybe help us get an explanation for why that might be?
Yeah, let's do it. So I did some research in the Behavioral Investor where I looked at some of the studies around the excitatory power of different conversations. So think about hooking your brain up to a functional MRI. So it effectively measures the amount of activity in your brain, call it, right? And so what they would do is when we think about things that have excitatory power or, power to sort of get us going, you think about sex, you think about death, you think about politics or religion. And so what they would do is they would hook these people up to these machines and sort of expose them to different stimuli, sex, death, religion, money. Of all of these things, more than sex, more than religion, more than politics, all of these sort of taboo topics, money has the most excitatory power in the brain. For us, I think it's like liquid happiness. It's sort of the way that we keep score. It's for better or worse, a way that we measure our success and failure and sort of the quality of our lives. And so in some ways, I'm not surprised. And, as you and I were sort of discussing pre-show, not only is that true broadly, the moment we find ourselves in is sort of a one where money is of particular interest and we're going through a particularly sort of manic period with respect to money, I think.
Yeah, almost like a deadly combination in terms of an overlap, in terms of a period of time where we've been more focused on money than ever before, but evolutionary and in terms of our brains, you've been able to find that regardless of what time period we're in, money is one of the drivers for us in terms of what gets our brains firing and stimulated and excited.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then I think COVID sort of took this all in an entirely new direction because we were all bored. Our lives had been, not anymore, at least here, but for a period of time there, our lives had been completely de-risked, right? I mean, we weren't driving, we weren't, going to bars, we weren't going to concerts, we weren't doing anything. We're just sitting in our houses bored. And if you're looking for a way to stimulate, yourself and try and inject a little excitement into your life, what better way than by making insane YOLO bets on your on your smartphone?
Yeah, exactly. That combination, like you say, of that predisposed interest in money, but also this enhanced amount of time that we had ready. I think that might be one of the explanations for the YOLO bets or all the kind of the Reddit threads that we saw as well that were focused on things like GameStop, AMC, all these kind of rabbit holes that people ended up down, which these were people that were maybe first-time investors or relatively new to investing that were dipping their toe in during this period.
Yeah, I think, with respect to sort of like the GameStop phenomenon in particular, I think you've got a couple of things that created sort of the perfect storm. I mean, you've got all the, everything I just talked about, all of the isolation of COVID, the de-risking of COVID, people looking to inject some excitement and some risk in a managed way into their lives. You've got the social aspect. Socialization is one of, if not the most important, one of the most important sort of pillars of our mental health that was stripped from us in a meaningful way. And so people found community in Wall Street bets. People found community in collective investing and collective speculation. And then perhaps more than anything, think about the narrative of the GameStop phenomenon. There were 2 sort of primary messages. One was you can get rich quick, which is like nice all on its own, right? I mean, that's appealing all on its own. But it was paired with this sort of righteous narrative. that you can get rich quick by sticking it to, the banks and the hedge funds and the Wall Streeters who took your parents home during the great financial crisis, who you can stick it to the powers that be who've kept you sort of in an unsatisfactory job. So anytime you can compare the sort of righteous moral imperative that was part of that narrative with the human desire to get rich quick, you've got quite a compelling combustible combination there.
Yeah, so many different things crossing over at once. And that loneliness aspect is really interesting because people were dying for community at that stage. You saw people jumping on Zoom calls with friends from school. I jumped on for quizzes and stuff like that with friends from school that I wasn't really that close with, but it was an opportunity to reconnect during a period where you had no form of social interaction at all, and you were just looking for connection. So what better way to find connection than a thread of hundreds, thousands of people that were all striving for the same goal? And the most interesting thing that you said there was the dynamic at play in terms of that power dynamic, because sticking it to the elites during a period where the elites were also telling you to stay inside for your own good, which a lot of people began to question during that period as well and be skeptical about, that probably linked into that as well. I would probably, if you did an analysis of the individuals involved, they would probably be quite skeptical on the lockdown measures as well, and maybe mandates and vaccinations and all that kind of stuff. There'd probably be a crossover in the types of individual that would be most compelled by that argument too.
I think that's a great insight that I hadn't previously considered is, not only are you sort of bucking the authoritative power of Wall Street and hedge funds and traditional financial institutions, there was a broader sort of institutional political mandate that, in a very real respect, the government and other powers that be were controlling what we could wear, where we could go. I think there was a rebellious streak that ran through the whole meme stock phenomenon that makes sense. I think you're onto something.
Yeah, I found it incredibly interesting. In a recent podcast, I spoke with a lady called Katie Gatti, who has a blog called Money with Katie. She's involved with Morning Brew as well. And she was talking about the stimulus checks that were sent out by the US government. And it's not been quite finalized yet, but a huge amount of those stimulus checks were put into the market.
Yeah.
A lot of people investing for the first time, particularly in crypto, but also within the stock market as well. We saw all-time highs and massive bull run within the S&P 500 as well, that a lot of that was fueled by stimulus checks that people had received, even if they were not out of work as well.
Yeah, so what's that is true. And the other thing we have to account for, there's a phenomenon in psychology called mental accounting, which shows that the way that people sort of label a pot of money has a lot to do with how they spend it. So here's a little aside, right? So there was research done in Norway on Norwegian criminals, and they looked at people in Norway who were engaging in criminal activity. And a lot of these folks had a day job, right? So they would go work their day job, and then at night they would sell drugs or do crime or whatever it was. The way that they would spend their day job money was very wholesome, right? So their day job money, they would contribute to charity, they would give to the church, they would buy their mom flowers, whatever. And then with the nighttime criminal money, they would spend it very differently. That would get spent on sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so we see that too in other parts of the world. When you win gambling, when you take $100 gambling and you turn it into $1,000, you spend it very differently than $1,000 you earned at your job, because it's house money. And that's kind of how the government stimulus got spent as well. It's effectively found money, right? It's like picking up $100 bill on the street, and you spend that in a little bit more mad way than you would $100 that you earned engaged in hard labor. So not only was there unprecedented stimulus, that stimulus gets psychologically accounted for in a way that treats it as less real almost, or more like play money than the money you make at your job.
Yeah, that's incredible, the detachment that people can have from the money based on where they've received it from. And I've said on podcasts before that the income that I make from my day job is my standard stuff, but then the income that I make from the podcast or my Instagram, I tend to use that as my crypto investment money. That's the kind of the money that I put into that space, or I reinvest it back into the podcast, of course. But that would maybe explain why I'm more risk tolerant with that money than I am with my standard investments, which are kind of ETFs or stocks and shares on Hargreaves Lansdown. I'm using my kind of fun money, my money from a photo shoot or something like that will go towards, I don't know, some more Bitcoin or some more XRP.
Yeah, it's funny, we had to reschedule this. We had to reschedule this conversation because I've been having some dental problems. And so my wife and I, every year we set aside just sort of a pot of money for just medical stuff. I mean, it's just money, but we set it aside. And I'm about to have some expensive dental work done. And I'm like, oh, it's no big deal because it's not real money. It's from the medical bucket, right? I mean, that medical bucket could buy me a new guitar. It could buy me a new car. It's just money. But because I'm accounting for it differently, it doesn't hurt. So it's a lesson to us to be thoughtful about how we partition and how we think about and account for our money, because you can use it for good and evil, right? Or not evil, but you can use it for good and for our own detriment. People who look at a picture of their kids before they make a financial decision save 2.5 times as much as those who don't. So there's ways you can kind of trick yourself into allocating that money in a positive way. But if you're not thoughtful about it, $1,000 is still $1,000, whether you won it gambling or made it at your job. So I think we can fool ourselves too.
Yeah, I think fooling ourselves is important if we can use it in the right way. I think that example you give, I think it's within one of your books or maybe an article that I've seen you write, where you were talking about people who perhaps had very low income and were struggling to save at all. And by having the photograph of their kids when they logged into their online banking, we're straight away much more likely to make a quote unquote responsible financial decision, which I think is an incredible insight as to how something can prime us before we make a big decision. And that compartmentalized piece that you've explained there would account for a lot of the decisions that we make with our money when we're maybe cued by certain triggers.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. We've gone off like a rocket, Daniel, but I've enjoyed it a lot. Can we go back and explain when you started to get involved within behavioral finance and what that maybe means?
Yeah, so behavioral finance is just sort of colloquially, it's just finance that accounts for the messiness of human behavior, right? If you look at the traditional economic models, they say that humans are utility maximizers, which is just like a fancy way of saying that we always do the most prudent thing with our money. And I mean, you don't have to look, I'll speak for myself. I don't have to look very far back on my bank statement to know that is not true, right? We do all sorts of stupid things. We do all sorts of stupid things with our money. We're sort of irrational and maladaptive in a number of predictable ways. And so behavioral finance is sort of the intersection of psychology and finance and just thinks about how people make decisions in the real world.
Yeah, I love how applicable it is, because I think if we were all completely detached and emotionless, we wouldn't panic when we see maybe situations like we're in just now, which in the UK it's been titled the cost of living crisis, with the rising cost of fuel, the rising costs of food, inflation basically ravaging or pushing the price up of absolutely everything that we buy, regardless of whether you're being told that inflation is perhaps 7%, which we're being told in the UK. I'd be a little bit surprised if anyone can name a number of purchases that they're making that are under 10%. But if we were emotionless and we kept calm during these periods, it would maybe be easier to deal with. Whereas there's heightened stress, there's heightened emotion. People are making financial decisions in that state. And then when you add on top that maybe if you are an investor, your crypto portfolio is way down, your stocks and shares portfolio is down for the first time in a long time, because we've had 10 wonderful years up until this point. I think having a discussion around how our brains and our mindset impacts our financial decisions is vital at this point in time.
Yeah, no, it is. And you give great examples. And this has been a uniquely hard time, because if you think of a portfolio of, just say stocks, bonds, and crypto, all of them are down. That is not often the case, right? That is not often the case. A lot of these things sort of offset each other, but bonds are down big this year. Stocks are down, crypto's down. And I think some of the more speculative parts of the financial markets are down, 80, 90%, even though the large indices are still kind of hanging tough. So, a couple of interesting things to think about emotion. First of all, emotion is a given. We need to understand this, because when you study the brains of people who've had the emotional processing centers of their brains damaged through a traumatic brain injury, these folks can't make any decision. Like they can't decide what flavor of ice cream to have. They can't figure out which color shirt they want to wear today, because even really low stakes decisions like which flavor of ice cream you want, all of these things have an emotional undercurrent to them. And so if it's true of ice cream, it's way more true of your money. And so there's no such thing as an emotionless decision. So that's, sort of exhibit A. But the second thing we need to consider, though, is that just because we won't ever make an emotionless decision around money doesn't mean that we should be making decisions at times of heightened emotion. So we know that in periods of extreme stress, people lose about 13% of their cognitive processing power. So your smarts are down 13% at the very moment that you need them most, right? Like all the good lessons that people have learned on your podcast are sort of out the window when they become emotional. So it becomes smart to put systems and processes in place to keep you from getting emotional. Like, I'll be honest, I try not to check my account. Like at times like this, I know I'll freak out if I look and see how much money I've lost. So I just try not to log in. I think controlling your media diet is another important aspect of this, and just being cognizant of what you're taking in. And then finally, I think sometimes working with a professional can really help as well. But it's important to manage that emotion because it makes us quite stupid.
Yeah, as a behavioral tendency, I know you've spoken about kind of 4 in total before, but emotion's a huge one, isn't it? Because one of the key questions that I had for you for this podcast, Daniel, was around money and happiness, and what is the relationship between money and probably one of the biggest emotions that we all chase and experience, which is happiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you think about money and happiness, money is what's called the fancy word for it is a hygiene factor. So a hygiene factor is the absence of it can make you miserable, but the presence of it doesn't always make you happy, right? So the absence of money is miserable, right? Like not having adequate money will make you very unhappy because you can't do things like eat adequately, take care of your health, sleep in a warm place, send your kids to a good school. Like all these things have a dramatic impact on our happiness. So if you look at, I'll use dollars, I'm sorry. So if you look at like the difference between someone making $5,000 a year and $50,000 a year, there's a dramatic increase in happiness for the person making $50,000 a year, because they're better able to at least kind of tick some of the boxes of what it takes to live, a basic human existence. But then if you look at the difference between someone making, 50,000 and 500,000 or 500,000 and 500 million, right? There's almost no difference, At $500,000 a year, that's a huge salary. I mean, that's like a top half of the 1% salary. $500,000 a year, like you can live somewhere safe, you can eat good food, you can get healthcare. After that, it's kind of on you. After that, it has a lot more to do with things like, candidly, your genetics, which is about 50% of what makes up the happiness equation. About 40% of what makes up the happiness equation is your choices, right? Like, are you surrounding yourself with the right people? Are you making prudent choices? And then about 10% of happiness is your circumstances, just like what happens to you. And so, yeah, you want to make enough money that you can kind of take money off the table, that, you want money to be there in sufficient quantities that you can do the things you need to do. But beyond that, it's really up to you and I.
Yeah, it doesn't massively surprise me that there's an element of a threshold. I think a lot of people band around the figure of, in pounds, £80,000 as a kind of an amount where you become financially extremely secure and a very high level of lifestyle. And then when money starts to go beyond that, the increase in happiness is a lot less than when you jump, for example, like the huge jump that you said from 5 to 50, of course, your lifestyle changes massively in terms of your ability to adhere to your basic human rights. So your human needs, which would be like shelter, regular access to food, that kind of thing, which on 5,000 is actually in a lot of danger to be able to manage that. So I find that very interesting. Have you looked at whether there's like a particular number or threshold that starts to balance?
There was a Princeton study out a few years ago, probably quite a few, probably more like 10. So we'd have to sort of account for inflation and things like that. But at the time it was $75,000, which I think would be, 80 or 90,000 pounds, so that $75,000, was sort of the threshold. And then after that, you saw not no increase, but it flattened out considerably, like up to 75,000. It's precipitous. Like it's very steep, 50 is much better than 25, 75 is much better than 50. And then about 75, adjust it for inflation in a few years. But, after you kind of hit that mark here, it falls off fast. The other thing that I'll say is there's a few ways where spending money has been shown to consistently make us happy. One thing that we can spend it on is travel and experiences. So travel, time with loved ones, and experiences yield a lot more happiness than things, because travel sort of by definition is stickier in our memories, and it's more memorable because it's novel. Like if I flew over to Scotland right now and hung out with you, I'd try food I've never had. I'd be like, what is this? What's this haggis I'm trying? I don't know what this is. No, right? I'd be seeing new architecture. I'd be hearing new accents. I'd be smelling new smells. It imprints you on a way that's memorable. If I buy a new Porsche, right? If I buy a new Porsche, it's really nice. If I buy a new car, it's nice for the first day. It's nice for the first week. It's nice for the first month. And then after that, it's just my car, right? Like you get used to it, and it's just sort of is. And so travel and experiences bring us a lot of joy. Giving, being charitable, helping other people gives us a lot of joy. And getting out of stuff we hate brings us a lot of happiness. Like I hate doing yard work. I haven't done yard work in years, and I'm very happy to use my brain to make money to let someone else cut my yard.
Yeah, so, that's a huge piece, again, and overlap with the conversation I had with Katie Gatti. We were talking about, we both outsource our cooking and meal prep for our meals, but also our cleaning for our houses and my flat and apartment. Mm-hmm. And by paying an individual to get your time back for those, it's improved my happiness, because I assign that hour or 2 hours that I would have spent doing those tasks, which, albeit I don't mind doing, but I don't love doing them. Whereas if I can free up an hour or 2 hours to go to the driving range or go to the golf course or record a podcast or even just go a walk, those are higher level return activities for me in terms of my enjoyment. And I suppose money would buy your happiness in those instances. So I find that so interesting that you highlight that, as well as travel, which makes an awful lot of sense, because if you're earning an extra £20,000 a year and all of that goes towards travel and experiences, you're going to have some incredible experiences that are going to stick with you, rather than if you earn that money and spent it on, like you say, maybe some more nights out or maybe some more cars or something like that. Those would be cool up to a point, but you've probably had those nights out before. You've probably been in that car every single day for the last month, and it wears off quite quickly. And I think hedonic adaptation is a hell of a drug, in terms of you get very used to a certain level of lifestyle or a certain level of possession when it starts to wear off quite quickly. So an extra, say you earned an extra 10 grand next year, say I got that rise from my day job, how I spend that money, if I spend it on possessions, I might just adapt quite quickly to my expectation of having that nicer watch or having that nicer car. But if I spent that £10,000 on new experiences, say I went for a week to some dream location of mine, that would probably be a higher happiness return purchase than an item, which I think is a really difficult thing for people to think about when they normally think, I've got more money now, I'm going to buy this.
Yeah, it's a great point, and one we can't overstate, and people get it wrong all the time. Because if you think about, my trip to Scotland versus my new car, right? You go, oh, well, the car lasts for whatever, 10 years or something. And the trip to Scotland is over in 10 days. And you say, well, wouldn't the car bring you more lasting happiness? Well, no, because you so quickly get habituated to it. From an evolutionary perspective, you got to remember our minds have not had an upgrade in 150,000 years. And so we are not wired to ever have enough. We are not wired for that. Because when these brains were built, my friend, you could never have enough. I mean, everybody was just living hand to mouth. And so complacency was a dangerous thing. You always needed to be pushing for more. And so when you get that $10,000 watch, you don't go, wow, I've arrived. You start looking for the $100,000 watch. So I think in a lot of ways, it's best to content yourself with a $250 watch and just try and be happy where you are, because the idea that you will ever have enough is a fallacy. And it's an important one for, I think, people to understand.
Yeah, there's a gentleman in the UK. I'm sure he's got a US audience as well. Stephen Bartlett. He founded a business called Social Chain, and he sold it for millions and millions of pounds. And he's now on Dragon's Den, which I guess is your equivalent of
Shark Tank.
Yeah. So I went to his live show. He did a live podcast, and he was talking about when he sold his business and he looked at the valuation when it went on the stock market. He was like, I wish it was worth, I think it was 3 billion rather than 1 billion. And he did some research and went down the rabbit hole and found that basically a lot of the time, whenever you ask people how much money they would be happy at, it's almost always 3x from their current income, regardless of what it is. So he was asking people on 80,000, they wanted 3 times that. Asking people on 1 million, they wanted 3 times that. And it's just this crazy thing in the back of our head that you think, well, when I have 3 times more, I'll be able to do 3 times the stuff that I'm doing. I'll be able to buy 3 times as nice stuff. And that will take me to a place where I feel contentment. And one of the most powerful things I think you said so far, Daniel, is if we can find contentment in a £250 watch, then we don't maybe chase money for the sake of it, but we chase money to buy greater freedom, to get our time back, to invest it with loved ones or traveling.
We would be so wise to spend less time trying to get what we want and to spend more time learning to want what we have. Because the truth is, you just never really get there. And Gallup is a big survey organization here in the States. They do a lot of political polling. And they did a survey just like you talked about. They looked at people at every income bracket, 50, 100, 250, 500, every single bracket. They asked them, what does it take for a family of 4 to be comfortable in your community? Every single one of them answered slightly above what they make. Right. So 500,000 people say 550, the 200 people say 225, the 85 people say 110. I mean, it's just like no one's ever satisfied.
At least it's not 3x.
No, yeah, it's not 3x in this study. That's really depressing. But yeah, spend less time trying to get what you want. I mean, that's baked into us. If you're working hard and you're doing what you should, you're going to rise, you're going to do well. But spend at least as much time trying to count your blessings, be appreciative for what you have, because that there's always something more to want.
Yeah, it's a very powerful perspective to try and have. I think when we increase our earnings, one of the most interesting areas that I've heard you speak about before is the element of lifestyle creep that can creep in terms of just upping our spending, but not upping the other areas for us. So like, what are some of your recommendations for example, I do really well in my job, I get promoted and I get an extra £10,000 a year before tax, and I'm really pleased with myself. Maybe I do want to just go and buy something, but what are some of the behavioral finance kind of gold nuggets that you would give me to that I could handle that situation better?
Yeah, the psychological concept that you're talking about has one of my favorite names. It's called hedonic treadmill. So if you think about hedonism, it's like the pursuit of pleasure, of course, and then a treadmill where you're walking and walking, but you're not going anywhere. And so what we find is that, that your consumption or your expectation tends to rise to the level of your income. So, I'm 42. I eat a lot better now than I did when I was 22 and I was in college, right? If 42-year-old me had to go eat the crap I was eating when I was 22, I would jump out of a window because I just have more money now, right? And so you just have to be careful. a bit of that is fine. Like, I'm not trying to be, ascetic or puritanical in any of these things. Like, a bit of that is fine. As you achieve a measure of success, it's natural for you to want to spend a little bit more. I would say just control it. So in the case that, say, you get an extra 10,000, I would just save a portion of it automatically. I would systematize the saving and investing of that money to make it feel as though you actually got a 2,500 pound raise and not a 10,000 pound raise. Because we know, two things, right? We actually did research recently on couples, and we asked them to effectively what they fought about when they fought about money. And the number one thing that they fought about was whether money was best used to enjoy today or to secure tomorrow. That was the number one thing that couples fought about with respect to money. And the answer is, of course, both, right? Like, both are important. You don't want to die with the biggest, you don't want to die with the biggest bank account. Like, that's nobody's goal in life. But then you don't want to eat cat food in retirement either. So I think the thing to do is, as you get these raises, just sort of make them feel less pronounced than perhaps they are. Elevate your lifestyle slowly, but systematize the saving and investing of a portion of that as well.
Yeah, I think the systemizing element removes the emotion as well, which we've just spoken as one of the most important primary behavioral tendencies that we have. Mm-hmm. And by, for example, when, like you said, giving yourself a percentage of the raise rather than the full raise, and some of that being saved or invested and moved away, is going to improve your ability to be secure in the longer term, while still, of course, enjoying the elements of the success that you've managed to have. There needs to be some sort of reward feedback loop for improved life conditions. Like you said, if you were eating as 42-year-old Daniel as 22-year-old did, you wouldn't have enjoyed the improvement in your financial situation. You would have still been living the same lifestyle. But of course, oh great, I'm saving or investing all this money, but actually, can I not get some sort of return on my improved situation?
Yeah, I mean, some sort of fun, we all have our vices, and that's not vices, but like, I like to buy expensive guitars, right? I mean, that's my thing, and that's fine. Like, as long as as that's a carrot and you know that about yourself, and you enjoy that, and you're still setting aside those raises, then fine. You should enjoy that, and that can be a carrot that can propel you on to further success. Just make sure that you're setting aside enough in an automatic way that you're not running on that hedonic treadmill forever.
Yeah, undoubtedly. We've spoken about emotion there as a primary behavioral trait, but within the behavioral investor, you speak about 3 others. Can we go into some of those just now?
Yeah. So there's emotion, there's attention. So attention is our tendency to confuse things that are loud with things that are likely. And so, things that we see on the news, things that are sort of headline worthy, seem more probable than they are. And we know that the news kind of fear mongers. And if something's newsworthy, it's almost definitionally rare, right? And so a lot of the things that we are tuned into are, you think about COVID, right? The market took a huge dip during COVID, and there was, unprecedented amounts of fear mongering during COVID. But if you ignored that and you just stayed the course during one of the most frightening global pandemics of all time, you did great. Like, you did great financially if you sort of ignored the headline. So attention is that. Ego is effectively our overconfidence. Overconfidence takes a couple of forms. We think we're better than other people. We think we're sort of smarter, better, faster, stronger, luckier. We think we know more about the future, and we think that fewer bad things will happen to us. So we tend to sort of own the optimistic and delegate the dangerous. So if you ask people, what are your what's the likelihood of you getting divorced? The answers to that are effectively 0, even though, 50% of people in the US get divorced and 0% of people think they're going to get divorced. And so I think if we're a little more honest about our odds and a little bit more honest about probability, we're better prepared. And then the last one is conservatism, which is our tendency to be scared of risk, uncertainty, loss, and to prefer things that we know. So, a good example of this is what's called home country bias. I think ideally you have holdings all over the world, but if you look at the US makes up about 50% of the global stock market, but the average investor allocation to US stocks here is like 80 to 85%. And that's here where it's not as bad because we're so big. Like what's problematic is if you're in Greece or something, you're in Canada and you're 3% of the world equity market and you still have 80% of your wealth in Canadian equities, then you have a problem. so yeah, those are sort of the other three high level.
Yeah, they're all of them equally important. The attention one really stands out because even like you said, if you just stayed the course during that dip in March 2020, by up until this point, pretty much up until the last few months, you've been on a massive bull run and it's been extremely profitable, probably one of the most profitable times in the market in terms
Absolutely,
of year-on-year gains. And it also links to stuff like social media as well. So when Elon tweets about Twitter or he tweets about certain cryptocurrencies, you see the market react accordingly, which is just incredible that people are still at this stage where they're so affected by what somebody is putting out there into existence. And I find that surprising. I guess maybe I've been a little bit over the course in the last couple of years where I'm kind of a little bit detached from it, but the general population, they aren't. They're still, oh wow, that shook me and it grabbed my attention and I acted on what I was reading and what I was seeing.
Yeah, so there's this great Ben Graham quote that says in the short term, the market is a voting machine, and then in the long term, it's a weighing machine. And you're really seeing that now because in the short term, it's all about sentiment and enthusiasm and emotion. And, oh, Elon tweeted about this, everyone pile in. Over the long term, though, if you want to buy and hold and be a sensible risk first investor, it's about, is it producing real benefit for society? Is it generating cash flows? Is there a viable business model behind it? And so a lot of what you're seeing now, we're talking in mid-May, right? Like a lot of the downturns you're seeing now, some of the huge like COVID names, Zoom, Peloton, like all these sort of work from home stocks that just went bananas during COVID are now sort of falling back down to the level of their cash flows, right? I think they're good businesses still, by and large. There's lots of good businesses in that mix, but it's for a while there, it was just the raw emotion, the voting machine of, oh my gosh, everyone's staying home. There's going to be a Peloton in every house. Buy it to the moon. And so if you want to make a quick buck in a moment of frenzy, then maybe that's a fine way to invest. But for the average person, you're going to do a lot better by thinking about long-term, what's it worth?
That probably links to the ego as well, though, because we have overconfidence in our ability to pick a winning stock. Like you say, let's just back Peloton to the hill. It's going to go to the moon. But actually, when the valuation kind of settles after a couple of years, when people actually assess what the company's worth, what its cash flow is, it turns out that there was a period where it was overpriced. I think we maybe see that with Tesla at the moment, where you look at Tesla being worth more than I think pretty much every other automotive stock, but it definitely doesn't have that share of the market.
Yeah, so it's so interesting, right? It's so interesting. I think that's exactly the way to think about it. One of the things that helps you overcome some of this emotion is you look at base rates. So if you look at the base rates for stocks, about 10% of stocks generate all the gains. About 10 or 15% of stocks just kind of don't do much. And about 70 to 75% of stocks go to zero or very nearly go to zero. And so you have to ask yourself, if whenever you're picking an individual stock, you have to say, okay, the base case here, like the most likely thing that's going to happen when I invest in this stock is that I'm going to lose all of my money. right? So that's the most likely thing that's going to happen. And that's why diversification is so powerful. And so you have to really ask yourself, what do I know about this stock that makes that other people don't know? And what do I know about this stock that makes me think that it's not just going to suffer the fate of most every company, which is over the medium term obsolescence and, destruction. So ego is the perfect example of that. The triumph of optimism over statistics and saying, yeah, I know most stocks go to zero, but this stock's going to the moon, right?
Yeah, it's funny, and that will bruise quite a lot of people's ego who maybe have dabbled with stocks, and maybe they picked a winner, but maybe they've 75% of the time they picked one that's not gone zero but gone close to, and they've ended up with their fingers burnt. And I guess there's a little bit of a contrast with that fourth behavioral trait, conservatism, because if we're naturally quite risk adverse and we're quite conservative in terms of doing what we know, surely picking stocks isn't what we should know. But maybe it is for some people, where they're like, oh, I've always just tried to pick a winner and back it, when really they should have, like 99% of people should be index funds investors. Was something that a chap that was on the podcast, a guy called Steve Adcock, he retired at 35, and almost everything he invested in was like S&P 500 and a couple of other large cap funds.
Yeah. So it's a great point, because they seem to contradict each other. I would say that not everyone suffers every bias proportionally, right? Like some people are going to be, there's a large swath of the population who is excessively conservative, and their problem is not going to be YOLO options bets on Robinhood and spending all their money on a single stock. Their problem is going to be never getting started in a time when inflation is nominally 8 to 10%, but is really much higher than that, as anyone who's bought a plane ticket recently can attest. So yeah, I mean, the only sure thing is that inflation is going to destroy your money. I mean, even in normal times, inflation is, grinding at about 3% a year. And so if you're not compounding your wealth, if you're not investing in some form of risk assets, you are setting 3% of your money on fire every year. Right now, it's closer to 10. But, you have to take some level of risk to grow that wealth and to grow that pie, or else that conservatism will get you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting you say that there'll be, like, if we looked at it as 4 dials on a dashboard, every individual has a different amount turned up to maybe allocate the 100 units that you've got. You could all be at 25, but actually most people are split a little bit differently across the board. So I think that's very, very interesting. What about your own approach, Daniel? Which psychological traits or tricks or pitfalls do you fall into?
I'm bad at all of them. So I'm definitely overconfident. I'm also too conservative. So I'll tell you kind of how I manage my own money. And I take the approach to sin a little to avoid from sinning a lot, I guess. So about 95% of my money I have with a financial advisor. So it's interesting. Some people, I took the financial advisor exam myself and passed it. I've written, 3 books on behavioral finance. I work in finance, talk about this stuff all day. People are like, why are you paying someone to manage your money? Well, it's because they are a barrier between me and my worst impulses, right? Like I know I'm biased. I know I'm foolish. I know I'm emotional. And so that advisor's job is not to pick the next Berkshire Hathaway. That advisor's job is to keep me from selling everything at a moment like this. 3 to 5% of my money at any given time, I am doing the things we just said not to do. I'm picking individual stocks. I'm, researching the market and taking individual bets because I like it and it's fun for me. I mean, it's kind of back to that bend, don't break conversation with the hedonic treadmill. I'm doing fine financially. I can afford to take 3 to 5%. And because I enjoy it, try and do little riskier things with it. But then I have 95 to 97% doing the slow, boring, buy and hold compounding thing. So, your mileage may vary. You have to understand yourself. That's what works for me. because if left to my own devices, I might want to try and manage 100% of my money and be all in and all out and, trying to do too much. But I know that's not prudent. And so I set things in place through automation, through paying someone to keep me out of my own way.
Yeah, it's incredible. It takes a high level of self-awareness to achieve that, but also like the self-control to not make a change from that decision initially as well. And I like the phrase, was it sin a little to...
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So that sinning of yours is limited to 3 to 5%, and it's all money that you can afford if it went to zero in the stocks you went into.
Yeah.
It's not going to be pain. It's not going to change your lifestyle. It's not going to change the apartment you can live in, the house that you can buy, the car that you drive, the holidays that you go on. It's a case of, okay, well, that was a bit daft. I picked a bad stock there. Or actually, you might get the buzz or the elation or the stroke of your ego that you might be after if you pick a winner.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's a really interesting setup. And it's always great to see somebody who has such expertise in this space, what their strategy is and their awareness of their potential flaws and how they mitigate those, because it's very easy for you to come on a podcast and speak about these 4 behavioral traits that you've written about and researched and put out there into the world and you speak about every day. But then you're like, well, actually, I recognize my issues with this one and I've done this to tackle it. I find that so helpful.
There's this idea in psychology called the knowing doing gap that shows there's like very little correlation between knowing the right thing to do and doing the right thing. We think that like, oh, if we had enough financial education, then everyone would be prudent with their money. Like, no, you look at, 40%, I think it's 40% of married couples have infidelity, right? Like when you talk to someone who cheated on their spouse, you go, hey, was that what you should have done? Like nobody's ever like, yeah, yes, that was awesome. I should have done that, right? And you look at doctors and nurses, right? Doctors and nurses smoke at a higher rate than the US population. Nurses smoke at nearly double the rate of the average American. And if you ask a nurse who's smoking, cigarettes, you go, hey, is this good for your health? They would go, of course not. But knowing the right thing to do and doing the right thing are 2 very different conversations. And so anything that we can do to put systems and processes in place that keep us out of our own way, to use that knowledge that knowledge kind of goes out the door at the period of emotion. So it's better to use that knowledge to structure your life in a way that keeps you from tripping over yourself.
Yeah, awareness of these traits is so vital. But then, of course, systemizing and putting habits in place that get around those. Because in the Laws of Wealth, in your other book, you wrote about 10 commandments.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the most important commandments that you wrote about?
Ooh, those are hard.
Well,
those
picking
are all...
your favorite child, I suppose. I've given you 10 to choose from, but you need to whittle them down.
Yeah, I'd have an easier time picking my favorite child. No, so I think if I had to pick just 1 or 2, I was intentional about the way that I ordered them. So the first one is you control what matters most. And I think that that's good for people to realize, because when people, like when I'm on a plane or something and people hear what I do, they go, oh, what's COVID going to do to the market? Or what's the president going to do? Or what's the Fed going to do? Or what's Trump going to tweet? Or, something that's outside of them, outside of prediction, outside of control. All the things that matter for you reaching your financial milestones are within your control. No matter what the government does, no matter what a virus or some war or some externality does, all that stuff's going to happen. Like if you look at the 20th century, 2 world wars, many, many violent conflicts, one of the bloodiest centuries ever, right? Virus that swept the world, killed, millions and millions of people. And the stock market did great, because the stock market is a bet on the long-term progress of humanity. And that's a bet that you can take every single time. So just know that the things that matter are in your control. The things that matter are maximizing your human potential, saving, investing, automating, working with someone. Once you get that down, you can forget about the rest and honestly go do something else. Like, go spend time with your friends, go to the bar, go watch sports, do something else, because once you've controlled the controllable, none of it really matters and it's not worth worrying about.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful in an environment, particularly. I don't know how much time you spend on Instagram, Daniel, but you see people talking about trading and flipping all the time. But the amount of time that they spend doing that, if you worked out what that actually paid them at in terms of an hourly rate, it can quite often not be worth it. And if you instead applied yourself in your day job, you might significantly move the needle. So I know that my commission or bonus for the year, if I bring on board another client, or if I get them to buy another product apart from just the standard products they buy from me, will be worth considerable financial money to me. Whereas if I sell a stock for like a 20% increase and I've got £1,000 in it, that's negligible. Like, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't touch the sides.
Yeah, it's Nick Majuli is a blogger. He has a great book out called Just Keep Buying. I'm going to forget the specific numbers, but he talks about that. Unless you have millions and millions, you are not going to be able to generate the kind of outperformance that moves the needle at all. And then, of course, even if you do have millions and millions, there's about a 90% chance that you're going to underperform people who are doing nothing. I mean, that's what the research says. So you gotta have two conditions to be met. You got to be in the top 10% of all stock pickers, which, you know, definitionally you're probably not. And then you've got to be super rich. If you don't tick both of those boxes, go try and get better at your job. Because
it's funny you mentioned Nick Majuli. He's good friends with Katie Gattu, who's been on the podcast before, and he's been on her podcast. And one of the bits of research that stood out for me that he did was basically, it's really obvious, but the more you earn, the more you save. So basically the top 20% of earners, they save 50% of their income. So one of the most important things you can do if you want to invest more into the market, if you want to be financially free when you're older, is just work on improving what your income is, whether that's from your day job or whether that's from a business or a side hustle. If you can increase that, then inevitably your cost of living can rise. And we spoke about hedonic adaptation, the treadmill, it can rise, but it's almost difficult to rise beyond a certain point. Because beyond a certain point, you should just be investing almost all of your gains rather than, like you say, if I get a 10 grand raise, invest 2,500 of it, and then the rest that can go into the market or can go into things that are going to serve me for the longer term. So I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
One of the last areas I want to go with you, Daniel, is somebody that has so much knowledge and so much self-awareness as well, which I think you've demonstrated throughout this conversation. What's an area that you still feel that you're constantly learning about?
Well, one of the things that I feel like I'm always learning about is just how little willpower we have. It's been a little depressing as a sort of a student of human behavior to just understand how primed we are by our environment. So you want to think that you can sort of learn about these things and steel yourself in a way where you become impervious to them. But usually we're about as good or as bad as our surroundings. So that has to do with, you know, the people you let into your life, the ideas you let into your head, the places you let your feet take you, the food you keep in your pantry, you know, whatever. And so I'm always sort of struggling with this romantic ideal of trying to be, you know, this enlightened man who can white knuckle his way through the travails of life versus just saying, I'm an idiot just like everyone else, which is the truth, right? Like, I'm an idiot just like everyone else. I just need good people in my corner, healthy food in my fridge, and you know, good books on the bookshelf. And so that's sort of a constant struggle, because I think we all want to refine ourselves or become this person. And I mean, you can change. I don't mean to be overly cynical. You can change. You can improve yourself. But environment is a much better predictor of the person you'll become than, you know, than some self-help course or something like that. So I'm always sort of struggling with that.
Yeah, massively. I think James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, had a massive impact on people when it came to environment design, because it's much easier to follow through on your good intentions and habits when your environment is designed around it. So leaving the book on top of your bed, so when you untuck your covers, you have to pick up the book and read it, is much more helpful than if, for example, somebody keeps drilling into your head that you should be reading a chapter every single night to become the best version of yourself. But if the book's out of sight, if it's in your drawer, it's out of mind as well. So I find that such a good example that you're talking about how people can spend their time and kind of chase down that better level of self by designing their environment rather than necessarily just reading about it or thinking about it lots.
Yeah, definitely.
Exactly that. Well, I've absolutely loved this conversation, Daniel. And if people would like to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
I have a podcast called Standard Deviations where we talk about money, mind, and meaning. So I'd love to have you join us there. My books, The Laws of Wealth and The Behavioral Investor, I think are worth a read. And I'm on LinkedIn at Daniel Crosby, PhD, and Twitter at Daniel Crosby.
Fantastic. I'll link those in the show notes below. Thank you very much for joining me, Daniel. And thank you to you, the listener, for joining us as well. If you've enjoyed this one, please slide into my DMs at call.cambro on Instagram. And I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.